Just before midnight on March 1928, a sound like 1,000 freight trains shattered the quiet canyons north of Los Angeles. The brand new St. Francis Dam, a nearly 200-foot tall monument to the city's soaring ambition, had just disintegrated. In an instant, a wall of water as high as a 20-story building began a 54-mile journey of pure annihilation towards the Pacific Ocean, wiping out everything and everyone in its path. This is the story of one of America's deadliest man-made disasters of the 20th century. A tragedy born from hubris and catastrophic engineering that California tried very hard to forget. For 5.5 terrifying hours, 12.4 billion gallons of water scoured the landscape. It was a 2-mile wide torrent of mud and debris that literally erased entire communities from the map. When the sun finally rose, the horrifying scale of the devastation was laid bare. The official death toll eventually landed at 431, but the real number is likely much higher. Hundreds of people, many of them migrant workers with no official record, were simply swept out to sea, never to be counted. It remains the second deadliest single event in California's history, topped only by the great 1906 San Francisco earthquake. And yet, while the whole world knows about the San Francisco quake, the story of the St. Francis Dam has been largely buried, a testament to a city's desperate wish to forget its greatest failure, and the man at the center of all of it. To get how a disaster like this could even happen, you first have to understand the man who built the dam and the city that drove him. The man was William Mulholland. Born in Ireland in 1855, William was a brilliant, self-taught civil engineer who came to Los Angeles and started his career as a humble ditch digger. Through sheer force of will, he climbed all the way to the top, becoming the head of the Los Angeles Bureau of Waterworks and Supply. Everyone knew him as the chief. He was a figure of immense power, almost single-handedly responsible for turning the semi-arid town of Los Angeles into a sprawling metropolis. Early 1900s, LA was booming, but it had a fatal flaw. It was running out of water. The population was exploding, jumping from 100,000 in 1900 to over 1 million by 1930. The city was thirsty, and William made it his mission to quench that thirst. His grand solution was one of the boldest engineering projects in American history. The Los Angeles Aqueduct, finished in 1913, this 233-mile-long system of pipes and tunnels brought water from the remote Owens Valley all the way to the faucets of Los Angeles. At the aqueduct's opening ceremony, as water cascaded down the spillway, William said his most famous words, "There it is, take it." He was a hero, a true visionary who had secured the city's future. But the aqueduct was vulnerable. It was a single lifeline, and farmers in the Owens Valley who felt their water had been stolen often sabotaged it. William needed an insurance policy, a massive reservoir to stockpile a year's supply of water, protecting the city from both drought and dynamite. He picked a spot in a V-shaped gorge called San Francisco Canyon, about 40 miles northwest of downtown LA. This would be the site of his masterpiece, the crown jewel of his water system. He would name it the St. Francis Dam. Construction on the St. Francis Dam kicked off in August of 1924. It was designed as a concrete gravity arch dam, a trusted design at the time. But William, overconfident and wanting to move fast, took a major shortcut. Instead of commissioning new plans, he told his staff to simply take the designs for his recently completed William Dam and just make them bigger for the new location. This would be the first of many fatal mistakes. Shockingly, almost no geological investigation of the site was ever done. The canyon walls that were supposed to anchor the dam were dangerously unstable. The eastern side was made of a rock called Paulownia schist, which is known to split and slide, especially when it gets wet. Making matters worse, the dam was built directly on top of an ancient dormant landslide, a fact that modern geologist surveys would have caught easily, but that Williams' team completely missed. The western side wasn't any better. It was a reddish conglomerate rock that had a deadly secret. When it got saturated with water, it would dissolve, turning from solid rock into a mushy, unstable mess. Building a dam here was like building a castle on a foundation of sand and sugar. On top of the geological sins, the design itself was changed on the fly. To hold more water, William twice gave the order to raise the dam's height by 10 feet, for a total of 20 extra feet. This added enormous weight and pressure, but critically, the base of the dam wasn't wide to support it. Then there was a problem of hydrostatic uplift, the pressure of water seeping underneath a dam and pushing it upwards, making it unstable. It was a known engineering concept at the time, but William, in his supreme confidence, simply ignored it. There was no external review, no second opinions. In the 1920s, William Mulholland's words was law. His judgment was considered infallible. The St. Francis Dam was built by one man's will, a monument to his genius and to his hubris. The project was finished in May of 1926, and the reservoir began to fill. The clock was ticking. For 2 years, the St. Francis Dam stood, a shimmering blue lake holding back 12.4 billion gallons of water. But from the very beginning, the dam was speaking. It was whispering warnings that only a few people heard, and no one in power listened. Cracks started to appear. Leaks sprang from the spots where the concrete met the canyon walls. The water seeping through the unstable western wall was even collected in a pipe and channeled down to the dam keeper's cottage for his home's water supply. That dam keeper was Tony Harnsforger. He lived in a small house just downstream from the colossal structure with his 6-year-old son and his girlfriend. More than anyone, Tony was the dam's guardian, and he knew its groans and leaks intimately. They were making him nervous. On March 7th, 1928, the reservoir filled to capacity for the very first time. The water just inches from the top. The pressure was now at its absolute maximum. 5 days later, on the morning of March 12th, Tony was on his rounds when he found a new alarming leak. Water was streaming out of the western abutment and was muddy. Tony knew this was bad. Muddy water meant the leak wasn't just seepage. It was proof the water was actively eroding the dam's foundation. He immediately made a frantic call to William in Los Angeles. Around 10:30 that morning, William arrived with his top assistant. They walked the dam and inspected the new leak, but they concluded the water wasn't really muddy. It was just picking up loose dirt from a nearby road. They dismissed the leak as normal and insignificant for a dam of its size. William, the Grand Chief, declared the dam safe. He told Tony some minor fixes might be needed later, but there was no danger. With that, they got in their car and drove back to L.A., completely satisfied with their own judgment. It was a decision that would haunt William for the rest of his life. Tony was left alone with the groaning dam. In less than 12 hours, his world would end. There were no surviving eyewitnesses to the exact moment of failure. The last person known to see the dam standing was a man on a motorcycle who rode past the towering white wall just 10 minutes before midnight. A few minutes later, he heard a tremendous roar behind him, but just kept riding. We knew the precious moment of failure thanks to the power grid at 11:57 p.m., 3 minutes to midnight. Transmission lines ran through the canyon, shorted out, causing the lights across the Los Angeles to flicker. In that exact second, the St. Francis Dam ceased to exist. Forensic analysis tells us what happened. The ancient landslide on the eastern canyon wall, saturated with water for 2 years, finally gave way. As the entire mountainside began to move, the massive central section of the dam was lifted and twisted by the escaping water before it too shattered. The entire 12.4 billion gallon reservoir was unleashed in under an hour. The first victim were almost certainly Tony, his son, and his girlfriend. Their cottage was obliterated instantly. Just a mile and a half downstream was a camp for the workers of Powerhouse Number 2. Of the 67 people there, only 3 survived. The flood then slammed into a temporary camp for 150 power company linemen. At Castiac Junction, with no warning possible, at least 84 of the workers perished in their sleep. From there, the water entered the much wider Santa Clara River Valley. Its speed slowed, but its path of destruction widened to nearly 2 miles. In the darkness, telephone operators and police officers became heroes, frantically trying to warn the sleeping towns downstream. One officer, Stanley Baker, rode his motorcycle through Santa Paula, siren wailing, shouting for people to run for their lives. At 2:20 a.m., the wave hit Fillmore, then Bardesdale, and Peru. Entire farmhouses were ripped from their foundations. The fertile valley was buried under a thick sludge of mud and debris. One survivor, a young girl named Luna, was swept away with her family while they clung to a mattress. A tree snatched her from the makeshift raft. She was found at dawn, tangled in its branches, the lone survivor of her immediate family. Or so she thought. Miraculously, her parents and siblings were found alive miles away, but her 5 cousins were not so lucky. At 5:30 a.m., 5.5 hours after it began, the foul debris choked flood finally emptied into the Pacific Ocean, near Ventura, leaving a 54-mile trail of death and ruin. As dawn broke on March 13th, the scale of the horror became clear. The landscape was a wasteland of mud, shattered homes, and tangled wreckage. Rescuers began the grim task of searching for survivors and recovering the dead. For days, bodies were pulled from the muck, some found as far south as the Mexican border. The official death toll was 431, but everyone knew it was higher. The public outcry was furious. How could this happen? Who was to blame? Signs appeared across Los Angeles, reading "Kill Mulholland." The city savior was now its murderer. A coroner's inquest was canceled. William Mulholland, a broken man, took the stand and accepted full responsibility. "Don't blame anyone else," he said. "Fasten it on me. If there was human error, I was the human." Looking at the grieving families, he added, "The only ones I envy about this thing are the ones who are dead." The jury found that the disaster was caused by an error in engineering judgment and the unstable ground. They ruled that William wasn't criminally liable, but they strongly recommended that building a dam should never again be left to the judgment of just one person. The city of Los Angeles paid out millions in reparations, though in the discriminatory fashion of the era, while white residents were often compensated far more than the Mexican and the Japanese communities that had also been devastated. The disaster ended William Mulholland's career. He retired a year later and lived the rest of his life in seclusion. The failure of the St. Francis Dam sent a shockwave through the engineering world, leading to sweeping reforms. California created a state-run dam safety program and required all civil engineers to be licensed, ensuring a disaster born of one man's unchecked authority could never happen again. The St. Francis Dam disaster was the worst American civil engineering failure of the 20th century. It claimed over 431 lives, and yet for decades, it was a story most people had never heard. It was overshadowed by the Great Depression and World War II, and quietly swept under the rug by a city eager to move on. It became a forgotten footnote in the story of Los Angeles. Today, all that's left at the site are the scarred canyon walls and a few colossal chunks of concrete, known grimly as the Tombstone. These ruins now form a national memorial, a solemn monument to the victims, and a stark reminder of the human cost of unchecked ambition. The story of the St. Francis Dam isn't just about geology and engineering. It's a tragedy about hubris, about the dangers of placing an absolute faith in one person, no matter how brilliant. It's a lesson, written in water and mud and paid for with hundreds of lives. About that catastrophic piece of getting it wrong, the roar of the water has long since faded. but the echoes of the warnings that were ignored can still be heard. If you find this piece of forgotten history compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more deep dives into stories that shaped our world. Let me know in the comments below if you'd ever heard of the St. Francis Dam disaster before. And thank you all for watching.